Now, let me introduce myself. My name is Benchakroun Mohamed. I'm an architect. I'm a university professor and a consultant for the city of Marrakech. Madam Chair has entrusted me with this file, the OVPM file for the city of Marrakech. Now, our presentation plan starts with a realization, which is a description of the current state and the current context. Secondly, we will talk about the HIC project, the Heritage Interpretation Center. Thirdly, we will talk about the pre-restoration state of this project. And the fourth point would be the restored building. So after restoration. And the fifth point, we will talk about future prospects for this building. And lastly, we will have some questions to discuss in terms of the collaborative network. So we will talk about the context, what we need to know in Morocco. So the Department of Culture is in charge of taking care of the heritage. In terms of the context, we have a rich heritage with many degraded buildings. So the buildings in Medina, many of those buildings are in a very poor state. Another point that seems relatively important to me is the absence of a special restoration budget. So if we're talking about restoration at the city level, we're talking about a number of people and a number of budgets. And what we've also noticed is that the restored buildings, these buildings don't play an effective part in the Medina's socioeconomic and cultural dynamic. And lastly, it's important to remember that Medina is a balanced urban composition with sectors and all the facilities needed for daily life. I'd like to remind you that the city of Marrakech is doubly listed as a World Heritage Site. Medina was listed as a World Heritage Site in 1985. And Jemaa El Fena was listed as World Heritage Site in 2001. So I will present the project. So the HIP, the Heritage Interpretation Center, it's a monument that dates back to the 18th century. It's at the heart of the Medina. It's at the heart of the urban composition of the Medina. It's a 10-minute walk from Jemaa El Fna Place. Its function in the past was to store cereals from the region. And in terms of capacity, it contained an incline plane to allow the animals to arrive fully loaded on the terrace, because they would bring back the cereals harvested in the area around the city, and they would come by mule or donkey to store these cereals in a number of silos in this building. Architecturally, the building's decoration is made entirely of ochre paint on plaster, virtually intact despite 2 centuries of exposure to sun and rain. So if you don't mind, I will show you a number of photos of the pre-restoration state. They show the state of deterioration of the building. It was really out of shape with a very, very high level of deterioration. Here in this photo, you can see the slope. that was used by the animals to bring their goods and products on the terrace. So there's even some vegetation and planting that has taken its place on the slope. So now I'm going to show you the restored building. It was restored as part of a partnership between the Department of Culture, the Marrakech municipality, and the Amral, which is a semi-state body under the Department of Housing, Town and Country Planning and Urban Policy. Grain silos. So as the fourth point of this presentation, we're looking at the future prospects for this building. The first point, which I feel is very important, is to find an innovative solution that will contribute to the requalification of the restored building. What we've noticed with the restored buildings in Marrakech is these buildings don't contribute to the socio-economic and cultural dynamic of the Medina. In other words, we'd like to find an innovative solution that can contribute to the requalification of this building. We'd like the restored building to be part of a new socio-cultural and economic dynamic, with the participation of the local population. We'd also like this building to highlight the importance of restoration by emphasizing its role, the role of restoration, its contribution, its participation in the lifestyle of the local population. What we've noticed is that every time we restore a building, it remains far removed from the local way of life. So we'd like this restored building to play a direct part in the daily life of the population, either in terms of youth, women, and a certain number of activities. We have a very young population in the Medina, so in my opinion, this building should play a very important role for school children, young people, to enable them to make the most of this building through training cycles, apprenticeships, and a number of after-school programs. So in my opinion, this building has a relatively important role to play in terms of its activities. As a final point on this presentation, I'd like to outline a few of the issues to be discussed in terms of a collaborative network. The first question is how to set up a safeguard policy with coordinated interventions. What we've noticed in a number of restoration projects is that there's a lack of coordination between the various stakeholders. The second point is how to involve all the players. Unfortunately, what we've noticed is there are a number of players in the city who aren't involved in restoring and safeguarding heritage. So how can we identify and understand the value of our heritage and identify the need for intervention on behalf of the local population? Here, it might be interesting to discuss studies to identify and recognize a certain number of heritage values concerning buildings. How can we identify and get to know traditional know-how and propose programs to support these activities? What we can say is the old fabric, there are a certain number of activities that are at the basis of economic activity. So it might be worth identifying and recognizing this traditional knowledge and proposing a number of support programs for these activities. How can we create a new conception of building by involving it in a day-to-day building policy? As I've said earlier, we'd like the restored buildings be at the heart of the activity, at the heart of the socio-economic and cultural dynamics of the local population. We don't want the restored building to be isolated, soulless, lifeless, and simply be a building to be visited. So, how can we do this at the heart of the Medina? By giving it a new function in the local way of life. So the historical function of the building can be changed with a requalification of the restored building. What we want is for this building to be a federator in a sought-after dynamic, in a socio-cultural dynamic sought in the Medina. How can we transform these lifeless, soulless, restored projects in a major factor in cultural life? These restored buildings need to play a very important role in cultural life, especially as the urban makeup of the Medina, we've noticed a lack of cultural facilities. So it might be interesting to think about the role a building can play in the cultural life of the local population. How can we enable the restored building to become a place of high attribute for young people? So every time there is a restored building, there's very little attractiveness in terms of young people. Why is this? Because there's a lack of programs for young people. And that's why it might be interesting to think about setting up programs for youth. And lastly, so how can we ensure that the restored buildings can play an effective part in a new social dynamic? That's the essential idea. We'd like the restored building to participate at all levels in the Medina's new socio-cultural and economic dynamic. Given the urban composition of the Medina, we think it would be interesting for these restored buildings, which cost a lot of money to restore, to play a part in the daily life of the local population. So that was our presentation. I'd like to thank all of those present and remain at your disposal should you have any questions or need clarification on any of the points I've made. Thank you very much.